it was interesting in that I just went back over some of the points I made with the parallels I saw in the Key with Gurdjieff, and it really stood to me that the outstandingly strong parallel, or the strongest parallel, is in the exercise recommended. I think in that document I forwarded you that I pointed to overall 15 different parallels I could see, but ultimately when I went through them, there were only seven I think I could isolate to Gurdjieff and his ideas. The strongest and clearest of which is to do, of course, with the role of attention and the practice recommended, mainly because that's so drawn out in the text, and either text of the Key. There are side references, if you like, to ideas such as essence and aim, and also mention of a part of a brain being switched off, if you like. But these are passing references, and of course don't really serve to make the case that Strieber has just ripped off Gurdjieff. However, on reflection, to me, it's just staggering how obvious it is that not only is Strieber appropriated another idea, but he's done so in a very clumsy manner, because fundamentally it doesn't stack up. That he speaks of this practice of balancing attention, and discusses this practice of self-remembering, and at no point does he really clearly even say, is this to support Gurdjieff? Is this to say that this is fundamentally a very pure and true teaching? He doesn't say that at any point in the conversation, which to me would be a natural response. Anyone engages in a spiritual practice or discipline always has that doubt that the practice or discipline he or she is chosen is not necessarily the best one, whatever that may be. And here is someone who spent, I believe, 12 years with the New York Foundation, and he has not actually immediately sought the commentary on the work from someone he feels is some sort of master. As anyone, I can only put myself in his shoes and imagine how I would react in the midst of this conversation. But there's just a strange, lack of truthfulness about the account. You've picked it up elsewhere.
Well, there are a few things that could be said, but it seems at least worth distinguishing between two different kinds of appropriation when it comes to what he does in the Key and also elsewhere. There are the things that come from Gurdjieff, which really don't seem like they could come from anywhere else, and which he doesn't give his sources to, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there are the things that are kind of tiny unconscious appropriations that he weaves into his big synthesis. But to me, the real giveaway is the part in the Key where he asks something along the lines of, or maybe it's the master of the Key who says to him something like about the law of 3 and the law of 7.
Yeah.
And rather than Strieber say, "Oh, Gurdjieff," he opts for saying, "Oh, is that why the visitors communicate with me on Masonic terms?"
Yeah, which is a very unusual comment, because it's not as if there is some central Masonic literature which is acceptable, which spells out what exactly is Masonry. What is the doctrine of Masonry? There are.
Well, even if you go ahead.
I was just going to say, again, I just come back to this point that he spent 12 years with the New York Foundation, where these ideas would have been second nature to him. He would have absorbed them better than he would have absorbed any codified doctrine he would have ever come across in his whole life. He would have been more educated in the work than he would in any other discipline or subject in his experience. And then when it's mentioned 3 and 7, as you point out, the automatic reaction is not, oh, the Gurdjieff work. You know, do you wish to talk about Gurdjieff? Or there's nothing. He makes a stupid reference to Masonry. And again, I don't quite know what to make of it. I still have questions about the conversation and about what Strieber is at. I mean, his own motivation is distinctly unclear in what he's trying to do with his work. And I think it's overlaid with some, or underpinned rather, with some very real and almost obviously discernible psychological problems. But, you know, we can talk about that, you know, at a later point.
Well, there certainly are psychological dimensions to it. The thing with the law of 3 and the law of 7, you know, I did some looking into the usual Masonic material online, and there's no way that anyone can, as a practical matter, master the vast literature on Masonry at this point, so that's a lost cause. But if you do simple searches for, you know, the law of 3 and the law of 7, you don't find any real connection to Freemasonry. Obviously, Freemasonry emphasizes sacred geometry and so on, but there's no emphasis on the law of 3 and the law of 7 per se, whereas in Gurdjieff it's obvious. I mean, it's called that explicitly. So when you consider that rather than being general terms, that these are specific terms, that this is fourth way terminology, then the question becomes, why would Strieber avoid not only, why would he avoid saying as much, but also in the conversation, if it's a faithful transcription, why would he, you know, betray no sign of reacting? And that to me is the tell, because his reaction is to dodge even an awareness that this comes from Gurdjieff. And there's no mention of the name in the conversation. You get other names like Meister Eckhart, but you don't have anything about Gurdjieff, and the question is why. And it seems to me that, I mean, you could go in the direction of psychological problems, but before getting to that point, it's possible to speak just of psychological motivations. And certainly if we take Strieber to be someone who is constantly trying to position himself as an intellectual visionary, and if we at the same time admit, as you just said, that if he spends more than a decade of his life in intense study at a Gurdjieff foundation, that would be the primary influence on his intellectual development. Well, then you have sort of a motivation for suppressing any reference to Gurdjieff, because if Gurdjieff is his most substantial influence, at the same time he's trying to position himself constantly as head of the pack, the forerunner, the intellectual visionary who's theorizing contact for the human future, then he doesn't want to draw attention to his primary influence. And that, as a basic theory, explains a lot of the ambiguity when it comes to his relationship to Gurdjieff, and also, you know, the obvious failure to cite Gurdjieff's ideas when they're clearly his and not Strieber's.
And there is also an interesting element to consider, is what he himself has revealed about his relationship to the Gurdjieff work and to Bill Siegel, who is his group leader. Strieber has admitted that he was himself given charge of groups in the New York Foundation. Typically, the trajectory for a pupil is that once someone joins one of the larger foundations or Gurdjieff societies, they're assigned to a group. Groups are varied in the level of development of the pupil. So initially, of course, he joined a novices group. The fact that he was given management of a group says to me at least he had impressed upon his group leaders a definite mastery of the basic concepts. Unlike other spiritual practices I know, the Gurdjieff work does insist on a very definite intellectual development, where in part a typical meeting would involve the exposition of a certain series of ideas drawn from the work. The fashion in which this is done is most distinct from how you'd experience this in a typical educational setting, in that there is an emphasis and a demand for the highest level of attention the student can muster. As such, what people tend to notice in your experience is that when speaking in a group context or when presenting certain ideas, the fashion, and it's not deliberate, but the style is for people to speak in fully formed sentences and paragraphs without the usual pausing and humming and hawing and so on and so forth. There is this demand, this requirement that any exposition is done from a great degree of mastery and understanding of the subject, which is a roundabout way of saying that Strieber, to my mind, is most intimately familiar with some of these ideas that are present in the Key. Alongside that, you do need to remember that he was asked to leave the New York Foundation. He admits this. He was asked to leave, which I had never heard of. I was a member of one of the mainstream Gurdjieff organizations, and there is never a situation where one would be actively asked to leave. Perhaps you don't progress. You remain in a novices group. You never become a leader yourself, but that's down to the inadequacy of your own efforts. He did say, though, he was asked to leave for just 20 years. He was told, he reveals this in the path, he did a great and terrible task to perform that would lead to his return into the work. I wonder in part, was he in some way charged to introduce the ideas of Gurdjieff into the broader culture, to do so cleverly, to do so without positioning himself as a representative of that tradition, rather to introduce these ideas or inject these ideas, if you like, in a manner which is more readily acceptable to the culture at large. This, while that almost sounds conspiratorial, it's in line with my study of Strieber, where he seems to, at times, almost wish to say more of himself than he otherwise would. I can think of some years ago, I remember he published what was an enormously revealing journal entry, and then he deleted it within hours, and it never reappeared. At the time, I had the presence of mind to copy it, I don't know why, into a Word document. Unfortunately, I've subsequently deleted it, but I do remember being struck just by what he said then, when he spoke to a sense of mission and purpose, beyond that which he ordinarily admits. I don't like to, in a way, damn Strieber at a distance. I don't really like to surmise what his psychological problems may be. I'm forced to accept the possibility that Strieber is conscious of his actions in a way I may not give him credit.
Well, I'm curious now about this particular journal entry. What can you recall about the contents or when it appeared?
I would say it appeared about 7 or 8 years ago. It was a long, long time ago. it forced me to, it was distinct from his other journal entries in that I copied it. I kept it in a Word document. I thought it was that significant. But what I remember him was speaking. I remember, yeah. He was speaking of a mission he had, but more importantly, he was noting the failure of that mission. He was admitting to the mission being defeated. And that was broadly related to readying, I believe, if I recall properly, readying the culture at large for greater engagement with the Greys.
That sounds familiar to me, but it's possible that the theme, as I encountered it, was simply the same theme appearing elsewhere. But, well, it certainly complicated the question of his own self-awareness and so on. In part because he seems to be so flexible in his thinking that he is able to more or less instantly rationalize his own behavior and his own performance in a way that's very plausible, even very human. But to my mind, these days at least, in such cases, it's more or less unworkable. For example, I know of at least two different instances where he denies that he has any kind of basic relationship to Christianity, for example. In one interview, he claims that he's about as much of a Christian as Christopher Hitchens. And in a very recent interview, he says something along the lines, well, I've always been very dubious about the idea of a God. So, he positions himself as a kind of, in the flow of the current atheism or secular humanism, which, has credibility at the moment. So he's able to position himself like that and say those things in such a convincing way that obviously he believes it at that moment, and yet obviously his entire thinking is informed by Christian mysticism. Titles one of his books Communion. His Catholicism, I mean, it's tremendous, the influence of Catholicism on him, but he's able to think of himself at particular moments as the run-of-the-mill public intellectual, who's totally independent of Christianity and so on. So that kind of flexibility at different points, it ends up being absurd. So when it comes to his awareness of his motives, and this is related to the idea of there being some sort of deeper purpose or sense of mission that he's not talking about. But the reason why I mention is because even when he reveals, more about his private thinking or his private reasons for behaving in certain ways, when seen next to these other kind of very fluid and instant rationalizations, it ends up, again, being something that you almost can't even use because you can't take it as entirely reliable. So even when there's the deep reveal and he comes up with something which sounds dramatically different, you have to step back and you say, well, wait a second, you're the same guy who, a few minutes ago said you weren't a Christian and so on. So you kind of see what I mean, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, there's several things that come to mind. I think there was something that I thought ahead of this conversation. There's always been something very unusual in Strieber's relationship to the strongest energies in his own body mind, and that is sexuality. He's I'm sure someone well skilled in the tools of psychoanalysis would have an absolute field day with his commentary and speaking on sexuality. I wonder in some ways is he deeply conflicted about his own sexuality. I remember him once speaking of Anne and him would watch this porn tape they had, and he revealed what the contents of this tape was, which was a whole range of sexual interactions between men and women and men and men and women and women. And, you know, I have to tie that to some of the comments he's made about the Greys and sexuality, and he sort of posits there's an ambiguity in their sexual living. And again, then I have to link that to his just mention, his off-the-cuff mention of sexuality and how he finds the whole subject hard and difficult and challenging and profoundly so, and what have you. This in and of itself would seem to me that there's a schism of some kind in his own self-identity, which tends to manifest in other ways, particularly in his position, in his description of his role in relationship to the Greys. You know, does he have a great mission? Or when he's talking about his own religious doctrine, I'm Christian, I'm not Christian. And then I take another step back from this, and I have to look at Strieber and consider that I assume he is an instrument of a higher intelligence for a purpose, and I wonder, did they almost deliberately decide to engage in someone so fractured in order that their message would stand apart from the messenger? But I don't know. I too think, and I should add, I'm surprised at how he treats sexuality in his writing. Even, I think on the one particular story, he has just dialogue which just seems unreal. How a girl declares to her father, you know, Daddy, I love to fuck. And it just seems, I remember just being struck that this is so fundamentally out of place in the story, and fundamentally an unreal piece of dialogue. He seems to have an incapacity to imagine actual sexual activity in response to it. In that particular instance, a girl is found in flagrante with her partner by her father, and we're supposed to take it that her response is a bold declaration of her joy of the act. It seems more reasonable to me that shock and embarrassment would follow, and diplomatic retreat all around would be the response, but no. So, you know, I'm sort of rambling here and just trying to, I see a lot of points and I just don't know how to pull them together.
Well, the subject of Strieber is that complex. There's so many things that have to be pulled into alignment with each other. I would say that the fracturing precedes the issue of sexuality. You make a good point about Strieber being chosen for being fractured so that the message can come through without the messenger. I would think that it's less a matter of being chosen than a consequence. In other words, these experiences have fractured him to such an extent and in such a way that the message can here and there in places shine through. And that's his chief problem. And when it comes to his sexuality, I think it's rather conventional. I remember a story him telling, and of course, there's no telling which version of the story it was, whether it happened, whether I'm remembering it correctly, but something along the lines of seeing by accident some sort of fairly intense sex on television, and I want to say that it's something S&M related. And almost immediately Strieber hears a voice of one of the visitors in his mind saying, "Oh, we don't like that."
Yeah.
Well, that's convenient. You know, when you pull that into the fact that in one of his novels, maybe it was 2012 or it might have been The Greys, the the novel where he poses as himself, the character Wiley Dale, which is basically Strieber.
Yeah, yeah.
The sign that he's really conventional and naive when it comes to things sexual is that he has a character named Marla. He actually names the character Marla, obviously named after Marla Fries, and he has his own avatar in the novel say something like, "Well, I really want to fuck her."
Yeah.
And it's so obvious, and you realize that when he's writing this, just in the same way that you point out that dialogue that he gave the girl made no sense and it's totally out of place. Especially in his later fiction, the dialogue and the imagination is so totally implausible. It's like he's reverted back to the level of imagination of like an 8-year-old child. You know, the way an 8-year-old imagines things and the way a 15-year-old imagines things, they differ.
Yeah.
And they differ in terms of plausibility.
Yeah.
And you read his later fiction and you just think, this is worse than awful. On the one hand, his language has this very vivid, evocative quality, but when it comes to the characterizations, the dialogue, this is like an 8-year-old imagining how it would go.
Yeah.
And then another thing comes to mind in, I think, Transformation, where he is imagining his quote-unquote friend, Michael Talbot, who was a confirmed homosexual. Michael Talbot, after he dies, Strieber has a vision of him being pulled to hell, dragged to hell.
Yeah.
Now,
and then
of course,
I remember too, there was a comment in Transformation where he almost implies was it to do with his lifestyle. There's some remark there. Did he said it was about some terrible sin or something? There was something.
Yeah. But you see, that's the thing. When you read it, he's very careful to, in all of the storytelling about Talbot leading up to it, he's very careful to paint himself and Anne as these kind of liberal-minded New York types, and all would never even occur to us to have any problem with Michael Talbot being homosexual. And then, of course, the Catholic Strieber, after Talbot's dead. I mean, it's the only vision that I know of Strieber having of anybody being dragged to hell. Yeah. And it happens to be a so-called friend of his, and what do you know? The guy's homosexual, and there was a question about whether he had AIDS or not, and then it turned out he didn't have AIDS. Well, there again, here we have somebody with a very kind of conventional Catholic Texas sexuality, if you want to call it that, to the extent that it's cultural, and it also surfaces in his communication with the visitors. I mean, was there one of the visitors who said, "Ooh, we don't like that"? Really?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, saving some great expanded confession from Strieber on this, it's really hard to understand, or come to any definite conclusion. But there was one thing, just as we speak about Strieber as a messenger, there is a question which asks itself, but it's by definition very difficult to answer, is that just how distinct was the message he brought in the 1980s to the general themes of UFO lore that by then had established themselves in the culture? I was a child in 1980, so I don't have any personal memory of this. But it does seem to me that to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was a preponderance of the contactees and their stories and claims. And this is basically the period of the benevolent Space Brothers. Then Strieber, with his $1 million advance, comes in and hijacks the cultural conversation, to the extent there even is one, about the subject, and he injects this idea of the mysterious grays and the mysterious ways. And I just wonder about that. I wonder about his positioning in the overall narrative, the UFO narrative. And in considering that positioning, does it tell us anything about Strieber? Does it give us pause on the question of, is Strieber himself just simply the instrument of some mind control exercise? Is he even a willing instrument of that effort? Is he some sort of ploy in a disinformation campaign? Is he part of a rearguard action by established interests? I'd love to hear what you think there.
Well, it's an interesting question. It's interesting that you bring it up. A number of things come to mind. I mean, when we talk about Strieber, again and again, we find that we come back to the idea of this guy who is basically helpless in a sense because he doesn't know whether he's coming or going. And this is what we struggle with. I mean, when the guy reads aloud from his own book and then later declares that the book was tampered with by sinister forces, and then when it's revealed that he read aloud from passages that were supposedly tampered with and he never noticed, and the guy says, oh, well, I was unlucky in that I didn't notice. Well, here you have somebody who, at least to my mind, I mean, it's maddening. It's just, you can't, what do you do with somebody like that? And what do you do with the work of somebody like that? So when we talk about these issues, we come again and again, maybe without realizing it, to an image, a picture of Strieber as being this kind of like helpless person who doesn't know what the hell's going on. So when we talk about his positioning, it follows naturally to wonder, well, is he an unwitting instrument? Is he a pawn? Is he used? Well, you would have to really look at two things simultaneously: the content of his work in the 80s and the effect of his work. I mean, I was probably a similar age to you. I was too young to have any sense of what the UFO culture was like in the 80s. But looking at it since, one thing that makes it difficult to say that Strieber is used as an agent of disinformation is that his work is such a mess. You would have to say what precisely in his work was being used. If you want to say that he was being used to influence the culture at large, you would almost have to set aside his work as such entirely and look simply at its effects. And if you look at its effects, you can only say, well, there are certain pop culture memes that come in. You know, he's always having a fit about rectal probe jokes. Well, there's something for you. Maybe given the popularity of communion when it came out, and that period of a couple of years where he was on the talk shows and that sort of thing, maybe by him being at the forefront, there was a tide, rising tide that raises all ships type effect, where abduction in general came more into the culture. But you're hard pressed to isolate in his own work the generic abduction scenario, because everything about his work is so bizarre and different when compared to the cookie cutter abduction scenario. Yeah. So you would have to say then, well, somebody, if they were using Strieber to influence the culture at large, would really have to be a master, because here you're using somebody whose work is almost as far in the opposite direction as you'd want to go from these particular ideas you want to inject. You're using him to inject these ideas, which are almost completely obscured by his work. So it's like an indirect thing. You aim away from the object in order to hit it. So if he's being used, there would be that.
Well, trying to reconstruct the history of the interaction with extraterrestrials since Second World War is next to impossible from our perspective. But I tend to find it credible that something like the Holloman Base incident or Holloman Base meeting actually occurred, that there was at one point an offer made that if certain conditions were fulfilled, open contact could result with assistance rendered. That to me makes a lot of ethical sense. Something I find interesting, in particularly that comes through in Linda Moulton Howe's reportage, is the distrust that seems to exist among many within the, we'll just call it the security apparatus for the extraterrestrials. I think too, in particular, the contactee Enrique Rincon, I think it was, renders a very plausible account of his meeting with CIA people. And after his contacts, what he claimed were his contacts, he was flown to the US and he was just asked a series of questions by doctors. And one official admits to him, says to him, he said, "We believe they're engaged in psychological warfare." This is in line with some of the extraordinary claims made by contactees, which do not come to pass. I know of this secondhand, that there are people who have had what were very credible contacts, but there is absurd elements included. As such, I can believe that Majestic or PI-40 or whatever name they go by now would need to manage the overall response of the population to their presence in such a way to retain the services of that security apparatus. To do so, you need just to do one simple thing. The control you need to exercise on Strieber is not particularly great. All you need is someone to voice ambiguity about the experience and the culture at large. That's it. Because even if there is a 1% chance there's hostility there, then you need to retain that security apparatus. You need to retain your military and your intelligence services, and you need to be cautious. And that way you retain the loyalty of your own population and protect it against the depredations of these groups.
Well, that's an excellent way to look at it. I'm not sure I would sign on to it entirely, but it's an excellent perspective. You would have to ask the question, how successful, though, was Strieber in communicating, the gospel of ambiguity when it comes to the visitors, the so-called visitors? Because even today, there's a fairly strong element of outrage and indignation when Strieber writes in something like the Communion Enigma, Solving the Communion Enigma, that he never said they were aliens. So if you go back and you read Communion and you read a lot of the transcripts of his early interviews, in that regard, he's actually been pretty consistent, and you're absolutely right. The whole talk of keeping open the question and so on, and not knowing where they're from, that sort of business. So he has clearly, to a strong degree, tried to maintain the reality of ambiguity, if there is such a reality. But then the question is, well, how effective has he been in communicating that message to as many followers or people influenced by him and so on? I would say he hasn't been very effective at all. Certainly the nuts and bolts people who dislike him, the MUFON types, the people who are invested in the scientists from another planet coming to study us scenario, as if that exhausts the scenario. They aren't really influenced by the gospel of ambiguity. And likewise, the New Age types who, see them as space brothers, and they're benevolent, they want to give us this high technology, but our evil government is preventing them from doing so. There's not much ambiguity there. So you've got the cartoonish caricatures operating on all fronts, it's hard to say. I mean, the way you're posing it, if Strieber were the the messenger of the abduction phenomenon per se, so we know, quote unquote, we know that there were abductions in the modern sense prior to the mid 80s. So Betty and Barney Hill, if you go back and you look at what happened to them, even though their story was presented to the public in the kind of environment of the Space Brothers thing, I mean, they see a classic gray on the ship who's looking at them menacingly. Barney Hill practically shits his pants, and the first thing he associates the evil face with is something like a Nazi, with that kind of meanness, that severity. And they're given, examinations, and there's a lot of post-traumatic stress afterward. So you could, if you wanted to, put the Betty and Barney Hill event into the normal abduction scenario, and there are others. So if we say that they were occurring, you might posit that nonetheless it didn't come into focus without Strieber. Of course, there was also Bud Hopkins writing around the same time, and maybe some others presenting to the public that scenario. But if because Strieber is such a big name and he's such a vivid writer, he's deployed for that purpose, again, it's the same story. He himself thinks he's keeping the question open. His writing is all over the place. The scenario he presents is a mess. I mean, it's a combination of Gurdjieff and Christian mysticism and the latest news from the science journals, and it's all over the place. But nonetheless, his work functions to give really important, significant momentum to injecting the abduction scenario into the culture at large. Well, then you could be right. But someone would have to be smart enough to know how his work, for being one thing, would nonetheless be construed as something else.
I take it as a given that within Majestic, they of course they employ and have access to superb psychological and psychiatric understanding. I think that someone like Strieber, as he was before he wrote Communion, something of a public intellectual, I think he could have been very well understood. And I'm also impressed by, I think, of the work of Walter Board, where he talks about he was an investigative journalist who identified mind control technologies, mind control efforts in the 70s. And there he speaks about what efforts had been made to manage the human mind, essentially via the brain, which is an electromagnetic system. And I sort of couple those 2 points together, and I think that I don't believe it would be that difficult to give Strieber experiences, those sort of ambiguous experiences, which would give rise to something like Communion. It may well be a product of the 1980s and Reaganism and Thatcherism, but something that strikes me about Communion and Strieber's work is almost like the contact issue is rendered a private psychological affair almost. You sort of move away from the significance and collective import of contact. This is an impression I had in reading his work. He in a way dismisses these things. This is not about government. This isn't about society at large. This is something more fundamental. And that may be true, but it moves away from the idea that what is needed is a social response requiring social organization with a collective program and demand and pressure on government and a governmental response. This whole contact experience is, if you like, privatized into the privacy of the life. Now, as far as I can see, this is distinct from some of the contactee cases which were in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which of course were oriented to a social response to their existence and presence. I know I do take the point that the abduction scenario had existed through previous points, but as far as I can tell, the discussion was dominated by contactees, by this sort of space brother phenomenon. And from what I can see is that Strieber's promotion of the Greys and his experience there maybe changes the direction of our consideration of the UFO subject. I suppose you can see this in something like the X-Files and through the 1990s, where you do have an extraterrestrial presence of very ambiguous motivation and intent. And that in itself has scripted the popular conversation, I think, that would exist about extraterrestrials. You know, so much so that even Stephen Hawking and the like will chime in from time to time and warn against the contact with such people. So I suppose in a very roundabout way, I can easily imagine Strieber as an instrument. I like to think I can imagine how he would be so used. And I also find it interesting that he himself never entertains that possibility.
Well, it's interesting when you put it like that. I would be leery of supposing that even granting that there's a lot of hidden scientific knowledge on the part of the powers that be when it comes to human psychology and so on, I'd be very hesitant to suppose that Strieber could be anything like a direct result, an intended result of what they undertake. At the same time, though, I guess there's a difference between intention and function. Strieber and his work, especially in the 80s, might be seen to function a certain way, divorced of the question whether that was intended. And when it comes to all that, of course, it's a separate issue.
Yeah, I mean, it then becomes a broader consideration. We here are looking at reflections of a reality. And I've often given thought to how easy it would be to whole-scale invent case after case, abduction story after abduction story, to populate and fill the internet with the stories that you want there. You know, I assume that the powers that be make that effort in some way. I think, naturally enough, they know it's something they cannot overall exact control on popular consideration of the topic, but they can force the conversation in certain directions. It's something, you know, when we talk about it, you know, I ask the question, how could you possibly know the effect of Strieber and, you know, at a distance, Hopkins and Mack? You'd have to almost look at what books are published going through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. What are the titles? What are the themes? My guess would be is sort of the Space Brothers theme is more prevalent in the 70s than it is in the 90s. And I would also assume that such developments are not left to, are not an accident. I have to assume that the powers that be make efforts to direct popular thinking or influence at least. Now, when you reduce it down to the question with Strieber, to what extent does he manage to control? You know, I don't know. I can speculate and guess, but I have a certain wariness about some of the ideas he tends to promote, and I see how they implicitly support a sort of status quo in relation to the extraterrestrial question.
Well, there I don't think you're wrong at all. I wouldn't disagree. If you separate again intent from function, there's an interesting parallel. If you there's There's a biblical scholar named Robert Eisenman, who I came across not long ago, who has written these massive tomes on early Christianity and the origin of different movements in Palestine and so on. And his very plausible political take on the real early Christianity is that it was basically a movement not unlike the movement we're told exists among jihadis today, super militant, apocalyptic, and so on and so forth. And when the temple in Jerusalem was wiped out, I think in the year 70 or so, and most of the original Judaism went with it, what ended up emerging were two kind of appeasement movements. On the one hand, you had today's rabbinical Judaism, which everyone thinks is a reflection of an unbroken thread going back 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years. Really, it's a sort of a political accommodationist movement meant to accommodate Rome. But you also have Pauline Christianity, the Apostle Paul, so-called, who injected all of these messages like turn the other cheek and so on into the formulation of early Christianity and made Rome, the central location. He was against Jerusalem as being the beating heart of Christianity. So Paul, in that sense, rather than being someone who was conveying the original historical Christianity, was someone who took it, flipped it over in order to make it a politically accommodating movement. And reflections of that gesture are everywhere in the Gospels and so on, where everything is internalized. So in that sense, you could see Strieber as a kind of Apostle Paul of the alien abduction phenomenon, where instead of, demanding social change in order to address the issue, and instead of forming groups and so on, of which I agree there was a greater consciousness in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, maybe for other reasons. But now it becomes a sort of Christian mystical internal, you can only approach the visitors through meditation. Oh, I'm quite sure the government knows nothing about this, and what they know, they don't understand, and so on and so forth. You could see his work in that way. On the one hand, it could simply be a reflection of his center-right politics and his Texas upbringing, and on top of that, his basically Pauline Christian view that, these things, for being mystical, are therefore individual and private and internal. On the other hand, you could say, well, that's awfully convenient, that with Strieber, you have this internalization and everyone is individual, and therefore less of a threat is posed by abduction in general to the power structure.
Yeah, and this render onto Caesar that is Caesar's. And I think too is of Greer's charge that, I can remember, was it either Hopkins or Mack? I think it was Hopkins. He said that Hopkins was financed directly by the royal house in Liechtenstein. He was supposedly the head of the powers that be. That Hopkins was his whole investigative exercise and efforts were promoted in order to inject this or support the idea of this abduction by mysterious beings. I think that at this juncture you have to look at what strikes me about the whole subject is how distant it is from anybody's concerns. There is, I think it's fair to say, I don't think there will be a public press for disclosure anytime soon. I think that the powers that be, if you like, are thoroughly insulated from any demands for an end to secrecy about this subject. I think in his way, obviously Strieber and Hopkins and Mack have contributed to that. One thing I do notice, while having said all of that, I do notice that there is a definite drip drip of revelations that comes through, which is to say that the powers that be ultimately do not want to stop disclosure. They don't want to maintain the secrecy indefinitely. It's more a case of they want to manage the process in according to a timetable known best to themselves. Ultimately, what you do need to point at when you think about this is that visitors themselves, extraterrestrials themselves, support this agenda. Because if they did not, they could most easily overturn it. So this then gives rise to the question, did something happen through the 70s and 80s? Why was there seemingly a change in approach from the visitors at large, to the extent we can usefully think of them as a singular phenomenon? I tend to side on the view that there is organization in their efforts. There is coordination between them to a certain extent, but ultimately, purpose to what direction? That's the correct question.
Well, it's very hard to say. To my mind, at least, the question of whether there was a change from a Space Brothers scenario to an abduction one, it's too open to for me to say precisely whether it even occurred. Because there are too many things involved. For example, the cultural setting when the stories emerge, and the differing details of experiences themselves across the decades and so on. It's I don't lean one way or the other on a changing nature to the phenomenon at the moment, because it's undecidable. But certainly when it comes to secrecy and the involvement of the so-called visitors, that seems clear to me. But I've said before that, at least as far as my view goes, when it comes to official secrecy and so on, it's an absolute lost cause, not because the truth will out. I don't have any faith in the truth as a cultural force at all, but rather because, like, I think it was Archimedes and his lever. If you give me a lever long enough and the right fulcrum, I can move the world. So if the powers that be, the power structure, decides that it's going to combat this phenomenon and manage it through this sort of historically unprecedented secrecy and compartmentalization, as a cultural thing, I mean, that must be really tremendous. And it's got momentum because it's a new type of cultural form, this deep secrecy and so on. If they think that by being secret from the rest of the great unwashed, that they are therefore managing the issue, they're insane. Because when you finally let's say you concentrate the entire management of the UFO issue in the hands of 6 people, 6 human beings. Well, if you're the visitors and you want then to control the management of the issue, you need only control those 6 human beings. That's the absurdity of it. If they think that they're separating themselves, but really all they're doing is giving the enemy the perfect way, because I take it for granted that if the visitors wish to control any group of human beings, that they're able to do so. So rather than allowing the phenomenon to become diffuse by letting it opening the floodgates, so that humanity as a whole grapples with it, which is a much more diverse system, they instead concentrate the management of the issue in the hands of a very few, so that only a very few need to be controlled in turn for basically the world to be controlled. It's absurd. But it could well be that that's what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many stories and accounts that point towards an explanation of this relationship between the powers that be and the extraterrestrials. As you speak about the absurd ambition of the powers that be, I do think of a comment made by Isaac as regards his documentation. Now, whatever the truth of this account of this story, there was something where he speaks of their attempt to generate the images, which are some sort of self-actualizing software and hardware. He speaks of the tremendous numbers of people needed to do this with the attraction of vast computer power. And there's just some comment where he says, the word apparently is that the aliens can do this in their hands. And that's something that, that is more likely, that there is just an enormous gap between us and the visitors, where the idea that there is any sort of meaningful contest between the agendas of some human-based group and some of these visitor groups is in itself ridiculous. It's just, useless consideration, which then brings you to admit the idea that what is happening is in some real sense exactly what is intended by one or some or many or all of these groups. And to what extent we can work this out, but I find that particularly interesting, without being able to resolve all the ambiguities and uncertainties therein.
Well, I agree. I think that almost certainly the way things are going from our perspective, at least down here, is exactly the way they want it to go. And that if there are accidents and things that are outside their power, we can't at present really imagine what those are. I don't think it's correct to say that the visitors are all powerful. That's a standard human type fallacy, because we kind of lurch from, we go back and forth between extremes. We say, oh, well, it's our government, they're totally in control. No, it's the aliens who are totally in control. Oh, well, probably the aliens are in control to some great extent, but they're not all powerful, so that, there are accidents and things going in an unforeseen direction, but we can't even really conceive of what that is. It would be, for example, like if you're on the operating table and you've got brain surgeons operating on you. They know what they're doing. You have only the most general sense of what they're doing. Obviously, they've opened up your head. They're doing things inside. They're just cutting, who knows.
Yeah.
But they have a much more precise knowledge of what's happening. So when something unforeseen happens, it makes sense to them. They wouldn't be able to sit there and suddenly explain it to you unless it were something that, could be explained in the grossest possible terms, like, oops, we nicked a blood vessel, you're bleeding to death.
Yeah.
Well, but if it's something much more obscure and precise and that would only make sense given their state of knowledge, well, forget about even trying to understand it. Yeah. So if there are visitors guiding our passage through history and managing our management of the alien question, there are perhaps things that are outside of their control, and perhaps, they're not all powerful, but it's even harder for us to imagine what those things might be that, we can't even understand.
Yeah, and linked here is the catastrophism, for want of a better term. There seems to be a large element of any number of contactee accounts and abductions. And you would have to think that, at least in some very meaningful ways, the visitor interactions with us is guided by a foreknowledge of events to come, if there are such things. They themselves may have some sense of how things are to unfold. again, it's an unanswerable, but what it does do is reposition any questions we may have about the phenomenon, to the point where we have to ask, is this directed towards, or are there purposes here we simply cannot know, that are just not revealed to us, and there's just a longer term plan at foot here. That's something that does come out in say something like the Myers case, where they say, open contact's not possible for 700 or 800 years. Or again, to what extent I can determine this, there seems to be an imbalance in the nature of UFO sightings. There seems to be a preponderance in South America. Is sort of indicative of, well, the future relationship between the South American societies and this phenomenon will be different than that which will exist between Middle Eastern or European societies and the phenomenon. It's for me, it's something, useful and necessary to consider, but, ultimately just leaves me confused.
Well, I agree. I mean, the whole thing is profoundly confusing. And it gets worse when people take sort of transcendental positions about how to overcome the confusion. For example, they'll say things like, they become dogmatists when it comes to these memes like leaving the question open, or we just can't possibly know. Because even that's a kind of mistake. I mean, there are people who have, a presence online who are big into this, where any type of tentative claim that you might make, or if you decide to put forward a particular idea in order to simply think about or speculate about its implications, these are the type of people who will go into hysterics because, no, you can't possibly know anything. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, it's possible to know something, but maybe it's not possible to know what you know, if you see what I mean. So that whenever you take a subjective state and you articulate it into objective terms, it transforms. So when you express a subjective state of confusion, which I might share, it's very different than someone objectively coming down and saying conclusively, well, you can't know anything about this. We don't know anything about it yet. There are people who do that. So for that reason, I would say be wary of people who say, well, we need to keep the question open. You need to look at them very closely and say, well, is this person someone who subjectively has got the question open, or are they implicitly trying to shut down certain types of questions by saying this sort of thing? And if you are authentically grappling with all of these issues, then you are automatically in an open state. You're subjectively wondering about everything. But it's the people who take public positions online and in print who automatically then have to defend themselves, so they're the ones who become dogmatists about this sort of thing, and it bothers me at any rate quite a bit. I agree with you, it is confusing, and there are certain things that can be known. I mean, you have to at least pretend certain things can be known in order to say anything intelligible about any of this. Even if in the end nothing can be known about it, you have to at least pretend that something can be known for your mind to operate.
Yeah, in a way, it's our conversations come around, full circle, because this whole issue of keeping the question open is straight from the Gurdjieff work, and it does bring us to the purpose, to the micro purpose, if you like, of keeping a question open in the life of the individual, to maybe Strieber's ambition to keep the question open on the macro level in society at large, to the extent it thinks about this. In looking at the key and the various spiritual ideas there, it forced me to obviously consider to what extent are these ideas drawn from Gurdjieff, to what extent are these ideas drawn from other spiritual disciplines, but then also to what extent do these ideas reflects spiritual truth, regardless of its presentation in various forms. And one of them is that, clearly, to my mind, is that there are, well, not to my mind, I mean, it's very well accepted, there are various states of consciousness. And within the Indian schema, within Vedanta, they do point to a distinction between gross, subtle, causal states of awareness, which correspond to waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. Then the two speak of a turiya, which is the fourth, which is the witness of these three. It simply is present and observes these. Ultimately, the Gurdjieff work in having people bear questions about themselves in life, and this is something done on a weekly basis, there's a new question given, is to force awareness to rest in this turiya, in this state of non-identification with the elements that present themselves in gross, subtle, or causal. I wonder, is Strieber in his way trying to leverage the vast ambiguities that surround the topic into some broader collective effort towards identifying less with the elements of gross, subtle, and causal awareness, and attempting through the mechanism of the question, forcing this deeper identification with that which you say is the reality of our consciousness, which is this turiya state. It's I might be over reading what Strieber is trying to do, but I wonder, are his actions just a little more deliberate than we see?
My first thought is that an answer to any question like that, it would have to be layered. You know, if someone goes outside without any pants on, provided the person isn't suffering from dementia or is insane or something like that, you really have to be profoundly distracted for something as obvious as that to occur. I mean, if you go outside with no pants, your mind really must be on something else. And when you look at all of the issues surrounding the key, the hysterical charges of censorship that don't make any sense, the fact that just a few months later, the first edition is available for sale again on the website, all of that just absurd, ludicrous nonsense that you see with Strieber's inconsistencies, denying that the inconsistencies exist, and so on. You would have to conclude that here's somebody whose mind is in a very particular place. I mean, I've uncovered countless instances of places in the text of the key mirroring very closely, textually, writing already done by Strieber elsewhere.
Yeah.
And ideas, of course, that Strieber is already in the process of formulating before the key even supposedly occurs as a conversation. You know, so all of these ideas that in the key appear to be new and provocative and not Strieber, if you look at the historical record of Strieber's output in the late 90s, just prior to the so-called encounter, you'd be hard-pressed suddenly to find anything that he wasn't already thinking about.
Mm.
And then when you read, for example, the so-called fragmentary inclusions in the Tarcher edition, here we have somebody who appears to be sitting down after giving himself the task of trying to remember things that didn't make it into the first conversation. And he ends up, for the most part, simply rewriting passages that are already in the conversation. Now, how can you not be aware that you're doing that if this is a text that you wrote? How can, for example, during a so-called censorship controversy, how can you're reading from the very book that you claim years later is censored? You're reading aloud, you don't notice anything. So again and again, there are these ludicrous gaps in Strieber's self-awareness. It's like going outside without ever putting any pants on. So you try to account for that. Well, one way to account for it would be to say, well, his mind is obviously focused in one particular place. His attention is located in one place. What is that place? Well, it's his mission. And it's the mission that you just described. If his mission is to keep this question open, and on a more basic level, to keep people from identifying with kind of what I would characterize as the genital sniffing phase of the experience, which is fundamental to all people. You know, obviously dogs will encounter each other on the street and immediately try to sniff each other's asses, right? What are they trying to get? They're trying to get the most visceral, basic information that they can. And when you take information, human beings are the same. We immediately identify, oh, what did the alien look like? That's always the first question. What did it look like? It's like human beings sitting around the campfire exchanging this necessary knowledge of the tribe in order to survive. Well, that, speaking from the perspective of certain spiritual traditions, is like the worst thing you can do, because you are identifying so completely, because it's on such a primitive level, with the sense data. And when you look and compare abductee accounts with Strieber's accounts, you see this night and day comparison between something that is very flat and two-dimensional, even when it's accurate. And frequently you'll find accounts that on the main seem more accurate than anything Strieber gives. But at the same time, Strieber's is much more not only ambiguous, which reduces its immediate accuracy, but when it does succeed in conveying something of the reality, quote unquote, of his experiences, it's much more rich, vivid, and so on. So you'd be forced to say that there's a relationship between him trying to keep the question open and refusing to identify with, the sense data and being certain about what it is and what it represents on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that he is able to convey these other rich details that other abductees normally can't. So now you have a layered scenario. You have Strieber, who, from a certain vantage point involving spiritual insight, automatically approaches the abduction phenomenon and the experiences in a way that others don't, and he tries to resist and refuse to identify with what he's seeing, what he's hearing. And he creates an ideology around that using his various influences, Gurdjieff, the Christian mysticism, all of these different things that he's read and learned, so on, about keeping the question open and so on. So he's constantly pouring his attention into that kind of complex kernel of work. But then as a result, he's left himself totally wide open from a different direction when it comes to the fragmentary nature of his own experiences and personality, the inconsistencies, and ultimately intellectual deficiencies, because that's really the problem. It's one thing for experience to be fragmented, but it's another thing if you're constantly trying to present yourself as the public intellectual of the alien abduction phenomenon, and your fragmentary experiences result in such inconsistencies that what you say after a certain point can no longer be taken seriously. And here's the guy constantly wailing and saying, oh, poor me, it's a public pity party. I'm rejected. There are forces working against the acceptance of my work. And the reason why my novels no longer sell is not because they're implausible to the point of being absurd, but because, sinister forces are trying to sabotage me just like they've always been. Well, Jesus Christ, what do you do with somebody and a body of work at that point? This is the thing I keep coming back to at any rate.
Just on that last point, it seems to be this real tension on what he's trying to do. He is to at once promote ambivalence, yet he seeks authority. And the promotion of ambivalence undermines that authority. And this is something where he's very, very, very trapped. He can't resolve this dilemma. simply put, how can he be an authority if he contradicts himself so readily? But at the same time, he has a message to share, this sort of mystery of the experience. It'd be very interesting to know just to what extent he's alive to this dilemma.
Well, I would think personally that he's aware of very little. I tend not to think of Strieber anymore as anybody who's human in a conventional sense. I mean, I really don't make any assumptions about Strieber's interiority at this point, given, the wildly ludicrous things that have happened. Although in reaction to what you just said, in a way, it's the perfect kind of authority. It's the perfect model. Because if you are somebody who is constantly shifting around in your position and changing what you're saying, if you can get people to follow you regardless, nevertheless, that's like the ultimate kind of following. So it's the perfect, I think anybody who seeks to be a recognized thinker or a public intellectual, or to convince others of opinions and so on, they have to necessarily divide themselves. They are projecting. It's the same thing if you are a practiced writer. A practiced writer will sound differently compared to the way that the same person speaks. Well, how can that be? You would think, at least like most ordinary people, that the way you write is more or less the same as the way you speak. And of course, we've seen people write huge books and wonderful things. So out of reflex, when we see a garbled email, we might think it's primitive by comparison. But when it comes to a comparison inside the person, writing and speaking are generally the same, unless you're a practiced writer, for example, in which case you can come to inhabit almost an alternate personality in which you're better able to think, better able to communicate. And by extension, it's the same thing with someone who has a public persona, somebody especially who's a public thinker. They have this fantasy, this dwelling that they construct for themselves, which is perfectly legitimate. I mean, it may be cognitively necessary. And that, in some sense, is a contradiction, but only distantly. It's a division more than anything else. So we see Strieber divided from himself. And we see, in my opinion, someone who seeks to be a public intellectual for personal reasons, which is fine. If you look at the trajectory of his career, everyone says again and again and again, oh, Strieber is a horror novelist who started to write about aliens. It's not true. He was a horror novelist for a couple of years. He wrote a couple of good novels, but then he started to shift into his lifelong Cassandra phase of warning about imminent catastrophe. Yeah. And he wrote a pair of novels, and maybe more, I'd have to go back and look, but he was positioning himself already as a kind of public intellectual on national security and environmental concerns. Mm-hmm. War Day, Nature's End. And that, in a way, is probably what he always wanted. Because you hear the stories about him, he's always creating this image about how he was in a politically well-connected family. And, oh, yes, my family knew LBJ. All my family knew Lady Bird, blah, blah, that sort of thing. So in his upbringing and so on, the guy talks about having had at least one servant in this house when they were growing up. I mean, who's raised with servants, for Christ's sake? So if anything, the horror novelist thing, along with his advertising career, were a deviation. He's struggling, he's in New York City, he's got a wife and so on. That was the struggle phase. And he hit it big with his first fiction novels. And now that he had some security, he instantly began to transition out of that into what was more in line with his ego ideal. He wanted to be a kind of authority. He wanted to be recognized as the bright boy, a thinker. So instantly he started to write these cautionary tales that were meant to inform the public and sway political opinion. And when communion came out, in a way, you can almost see the delight with which he wrote that book to be him seeing that as kind of like the apex of that image. Now he has totally virgin territory, all to himself. He's going to be the public intellectual of the abduction phenomenon. He's going to sway public opinion. He's going to trailblaze the whole thing wide open.
Oh, and there's more, of course. He is on standby to be the public intellectual primus inter pares, because he has at the ready the book which will be published in the event of open disclosure.
Wait, say that again?
Yeah, Strieber once spoke of the fact that he has an unpublished book. He has a book at the ready, which is to be published in the event that disclosure becomes public, in line with, he spoke of the events in Belgium in the Low Countries in the early 90s, that this was an attempt by the Greys to launch a declaration of their own existence into humanity. He has spoken that he has, if that were to proceed, then he has a book at the ready, which is to explain and ready humanity and prepare humanity for managing that relationship.
Well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that he said that, but my reaction is bullshit.
Yeah.
Well, let's say that he made that comment in the late 90s, right? Or even like 2001. Well, whatever he wrote is by now dated, no matter what.
Yeah, I did ask him for a copy, and he said no. And yeah, but I suppose, I mean, to make mention of this, to point to his own extremely high regard for his intellectual abilities, which that comment also has to go with the other. It may be actually a reflection of a certain truth. Maybe he is the man to actually make those explanations, or be so positioned in the event of an open contact, which, you know, as I say that, I do think explains to some small part Strieber's bitterness. There is a definite tone of bitterness in his account of his own reception at the culture at large, and it's quite believable if you think yourself as having been readied as the man to translate a declaration by the Greys, to translate the meaning and significance of that to humanity at large. You know, you too would be a little bitter if that never came to pass. on all the while you're stuck doing Dreamland, you know, the stupid interviews he has to do.
No, I fully agree. In fact, I think it's exactly symmetrical, because psychologically, he's all in on this particular mission for himself. I mean, it's slightly different than the stated mission. This is the thing. He has stated in many places, well, you know, my mission is, well, for example, the disappearing journal entry that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Whatever public statements he's made about what his mission is, his personal mission is, that in a way is separate from what appears to us as outsiders as his kind of like psychological purpose. Everybody gives themselves a kind of psychological place in the world. Without ever being fully aware of it, a place is formed for them that they participate in forming for themselves, and that is who they are. Now, in most people, I would dare say it's a little bit fragmentary. They are this, they are that, they are something else. Strieber, of course, because of the importance of his mission, the world historical importance of the alien issue, he is all in on the public intellectual of the alien abduction phenomenon purpose. And for him to fail completely at that, to be fully rejected in that capacity, is a rejection that he takes absolutely intimately. It drives him nuts. That's why he's always, you know, kvetching about it, and bitter, and making nasty remarks, and seeing, every criticism as a result of social engineering and so on. I mean, he's got no grasp of reality when it comes to that. There are cases where he'll be mentioned in an article somewhere, like on the Huffington Post, and a lot of, in fact, there's a specific instance I'd have to pull up, but I think I can basically get it right. There was an article in the Huffington Post, maybe it was a Lee Spiegel article, where Strieber's mentioned. And Strieber ends up going to unknown country, maybe in a journal entry, and he writes about how, all of these people in the comments section are making hateful comments about him and making rectal probe jokes and that sort of thing, and how he's despised and how there's probably even social engineering government input behind it. Well, if you go to the article and you look at all the comments, it's a totally different story. I mean, they're obviously not positive about Strieber. They're indifferent. They don't even mention him because Strieber is just a small part of the article. It's just the usual internet nonsense comments.
Yeah.
Which he interprets so easily as this intimate personal attack, and it's got no bearing on reality. So then you have to say, well, how can that occur? Well, obviously, this is the reason why.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly I picked up on this too. He often refers to, he was on that show where with that Scottish comedian, and I can't remember his purpose of being on the show, but he referred to this, how he was mocked and the rest of it. But having watched the interview, I found that he received an extraordinarily fair audience. He needs to be alive to the sense that the claims he making are to the public at large extraordinary, to say the least. To find that your run-of-the-mill chat show host actually gives him a fair audience at times, he should be immensely grateful for that. But instead he walks away and he misrepresents what occurred. He grossly misrepresents it. But that's just part of something else I noticed. He speaks about his reception in the 1980s. I've watched some interviews with Larry King, watched an interview with Snyder, who, I had to research who this guy Snyder was, but at the time he was the top chat show host in the US. Now, Strieber got, I think, I may have this wrong, but he got a 20-something minute interview. In that time, Snyder fully treated him with respect, and he spoke to him. His questions were guided by intelligence. There was no ridicule present at all. And I just don't understand what the hell Strieber is talking about when he's saying, oh, they laughed at me here and they laughed at me there. It's just not happening. It just didn't happen. But then more to that, there is, again, we're looking at this issue of sexuality. When he speaks about this rectal probe, how I was raped. I mean, come on, if you go to the doctor and he's checking your prostate and he sticks his finger up your ass, you don't think you're raped. It's just an uncomfortable, unfortunate, exercise. And surely you would think in the context of an abduction by alien beings, they're not intent on having a good time at Whitley Strieber's ass. I mean, there perhaps was, a medical or a scientific purpose behind it, yet he holds on to it, he promotes it as rape, then he misrepresents how that experience is reported in the culture at large. And this seems to be a broader piece of projecting onto his media reception all sorts of absurd paranoia, which belies the actual reception he received on the publishing of Communion, which to my mind was extraordinary. And it was also a reception, if I may add, I can't conceive of being possible today.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Yeah. If you look at the amount of media attention he got and the amount of airtime he got and so on, number one, it certainly wouldn't be possible today. Number two, I mean, you could say when you have made your whole purpose in life to be this, this prophet of the alien abduction paradigm, no amount of attention is enough until finally you have everyone listening to you and doing what you say. And if you say there needs to be a government research panel for this, and then there better be one, so on and so forth. So the higher the monkey climbs, the more it shows its tail, so to speak. But the issue of the rape bit is actually quite interesting, and it's quite convoluted. If you go back and you look at Communion, already in Communion, you have a statement to the effect of that, if you laugh at the victims of alien abduction, it's like laughing at rape victims.
Yeah.
So already he's making that connection. But many decades later, he's saying, well, it took me 25 years to tell my wife that I had been raped. Now, obviously what's going on is he's just sort of condensed the connection between the rape victim and the alien abductee. Also in the mix is the fact that along the way, he apparently realized or concluded, this is more important to say because you can't really trust anything he says in this regard anymore, but he concluded that what happened to him was that he had been given an electroejaculator. And I remember him talking about how someone who had worked with cattle had told him that it sounded like electroejaculator. So in that regard, to the extent that something stuck into your rectum elicits a sexual reaction, sexual response, okay, then you can make the connection to rape. But obviously what's really going on is that Strieber is trying to, capitalize in a way. That's maybe the wrong word, but he's capitalizing on the moral outrage we show to people laughing at rape victims by trying to make an equivalence between that type of ridicule, which is not accepted, and the ridicule of abductees, which is accepted.
Yeah.
But there again, I mean, the important thing to say is that it's extremely convoluted. You've got him writing about some sort of rectal probe in communion, and then only later deciding that it was an electroejaculator device. Now, I don't remember the details from communion, unfortunately, at this point, but you would think that if there had been an erection induced and an ejaculation as a result of this thing being inserted into his rear end, that would have been in communion. And if it wasn't in communion, why not? And if it was, why didn't he associate the two? I mean, even if you don't know what an electroejaculator is, even if you don't know that it's a worldly device used in animal husbandry, that was the phrase I remember him using that phrase now, animal husbandry. So even if you don't know that the thing is used on Earth, you could probably draw a causal connection between the one and the other and say, well, that's what they did. So again, it's like, why are these basic details missing? Or if they're not missing, why isn't the connection being made? And then why 25 years later is it now, I was raped. I'm a rape victim.
Yeah, and then two is what is absent in that analysis and absent in most of his analysis of that experience is something he spoke of at one point where he said, this was necessary for me to remember the experience, this gross physical trauma. Otherwise, he wouldn't remember it. Now, here, all I can do is consider what I've heard from people I personally know who have had contact with extraterrestrials. And in their account, there is no danger whatsoever that they would forget the account. Because it actually, in their experience, and I trust that, is that it actually happened. And I think with Strieber, the way he's managed, he has held on to his authority, is by denying the ambiguity of that experience there. That I am sure, like the encounter with the Master of the Key, this is in this lucid state. A lot of this is happening not in the waking state. It's happening in this lucid state, which can be so visceral in its way. It can be so real in its way that it has a reality sufficient enough to impress itself upon your awareness as actually having happened. So what I'm really trying to get at is that for me, Strieber's accounts of his experience, they just don't add up in the sense that he himself is more uncertain about them than he should be.
Well, I think you're right on that point, that he's more uncertain about the ones that should be plain than he should be. But at the same time, I think that is because of Strieber himself, who he is. You know, I've said elsewhere that when you listen to Strieber, you know, access his own memory about events, and you hear that hard drive spin up inside of his head, what you actually see and hear happening is him imagining what happened. He remembers by imagining.
Yeah, I mean that is that's a very acute insight, and I really like that. You have written that, and I've thought about that a lot. But one thing I've noticed with Strieber, and I listened to him in conversation with John Hogue in January, where they're talking about Putin, and Hogue, to his credit, seems possessed of a genuinely flexible intelligence. He basically parries Strieber's assertions with elegance and some skill. But Hogue is trying to talk about, he was making the point that he's studied Putin and Russia as much as he can from the perspective of Russians, or at least non-American, from non-American perspectives. And Hogue at one point sort of gently says to Strieber, when Strieber just posited the possibility that the Russians would be involved in floating plutonium up the Potomac with the view of laying waste to Washington D.C. And that was what Strieber was more or less said. Hogue sort of hums and haws and said, well, you know, I really don't think so. There's nothing in my reading of Putin to suggest he's set to perform the greatest act of terrorism in human history with virtually incalculable consequences. And Strieber leaps at him. Strieber jumps in and says, well, I'm more than willing to go head to head with you there, which is such an absurd, ridiculous thing to say. I mean, we all have a sense of that which we don't know and understand. Russian politics is perforce inaccessible to someone who doesn't speak Russian. You just really are not going to have some refined understanding of the machinations of the Kremlin without a real grounding in Russian history and politics and an understanding of the language. Strieber has none of these, but he is dogmatic in his reading of Putin and his motivation, which is to say that stands in interesting contrast to his willed ambivalence about other experiences, in that he's ready to be dogmatic about that which he must know he knows little, yet he plays this, he's more than happy to play every side of every street when he's talking about intimate experience.
Well, that's very true. I would unpack that in the following way. You know, when you see a little kid playing with toys, or if they're role playing or something along those lines, you see immediately that the difference between a child imagination and an adult imagination is that in the child, imagination is totally captivating. You can stand there in a room with people and with a little toy plane, fly it around, and not have your imaginary world penetrated by the fact that there are these people who obviously aren't participating. So in childhood, imagination can be entirely captivating. You can entirely inhabit your imagination and live there if you like. In Strieber, in terms of imagination, that possibility is not foreclosed to him. He can be entirely captivated and be entranced by his imagination. Now, if you listen to him reading some of his audio excerpts, where he's reading from his own fiction, and he goes into character voices, the voices are not at all dramatically convincing. He's not a professional actor and so on. But he's obviously totally absorbed into these often silly characters that he's created. Well, what does this have to do with what you just said? Well, we know that one major thread in Strieber's career has been his imagining disaster scenarios.
Okay.
Now, how does this relate to everything else? Well, obviously, if you are positioning yourself as a public intellectual who is warning the public of dangers, because you're kind of like a Moses guiding your tribe out in the wilderness, then your success, your talent in that regard, will hinge on the ability to imagine these things happening that no one else has the foresight to see. So he's constantly in high gear imagining every disaster scenario he can, and he has to insist that they are real, because on the one hand, you have to treat them as real in order to guard against them, but then on the other hand, his whole purpose as this Cassandra, this public intellectual warning, the tribe, depends on him insisting that it all be taken seriously. That's his job. So when John Hogue says, well, I don't see any evidence that Putin's going to float radioactive materials into Washington, D.C., Strieber's mortified and indignant because you have to take this shit seriously. Why? Because I'm telling you, number one, it's a lurid scenario. Number two, I'm awfully bright for having thought of it. And number three, you have to take it seriously because my job is to insist that you do. But he's like that for every frigging scenario. I mean, the guy will write a little ebook called Solar Flares. Now, I haven't read it. If I had to place money on it, without much hesitation, I would suggest that probably it's another work of catastrophe, where if we don't start taking steps now, of course, Strieber's in his public advisory mode, we need to do this, this, and this to protect against the solar flares. And if we don't, well, then we get into the word disaster scenario. 5 billion people will be wiped out instantly and the other billion will starve. And this is his mode. This is what he's always done.
Yeah, as you say that, I immediately loop back to this issue of appropriation, because I distinctly remember his interview of a mainstream science journalist, I think his name was Joseph, who wrote a book on 2012. And he is very mainstream. He's written for, I think, New York Times and The Atlantic and what have you. And he set out to explore in almost a humorous way the various disaster scenarios being posited for the near future. And as he does so, he does outline, he said there is actually one scenario which is very, very plausible. That is the solar flare event. And he speaks about the Carrington event in 1850, whatever. And he said if such an event were to occur today, it would have all these effects, which he researched and studied in the rest. And he did make a point. He said that he spoke about this, he was invited to a conference, to a secret conference, to a private conference held in, he doesn't say which country, where many representatives of developed nations sat down to actually prepare against such an event. So, which is all to say that this issue of solar flares and the threat and the danger comes from this man. This I can't recall. I'm sure if I sat down and searched it up, I'd find it. But I remember him talking about this. And of course, then Strieber, seemingly, it sounds like he just ripped off what must have been a chapter in this man's book and blew it out into an ebook and claimed it as his own.